if high-income nations went to plant-based diets, you could sequester enough carbon that would equate to 12 years of global agricultural emissions over the long term. So that's a total opportunity that is massive if we were able to do it.
Good afternoon. This is another Welcome to a Facing Future program here at COP26. Today, we're going to talk about food matters. We have two renowned experts in the field of food. Helen Harwitt is a senior research fellow at Chatham House, and Paul Behrens is the author and academic of a recent book called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science. Welcome to you both. The Green Revolution yielded us temporary results and has allowed the human population to swell in the billions. Now we are brought to the brink of an unprecedented catastrophe because of our ability to feed people, and then the failure to feed people is coming right behind it. It's sort of a terrifying situation. Our diets became meat-heavy during that time. And now we recognize that this industrial agriculture system that we have, particularly in the first world, is disastrous for wildlife, for soils, and is destroying our carbon sinks and producing greenhouse gases. So we're going to begin with the pessimistic side of things and talk about just what the world food situation is looking like now and what we are doing and how, what we need to change.
Thanks, thank you. So the issue really is on consumption here. There is some remaining growth in emissions from population, but it's the consumption of this heavy animal agriculture diet, the industrial agriculture that is really driving the system to destruction. And in my book, I looked at the pessimistic and the hopeful perspectives in paired chapters: food, energy systems, climate, economics. In the food system, the pessimistic situation is actually coming along in the next couple of decades. We are looking at significant declines in yields. There is a flood of papers coming out on these reductions in yields in major crops around the world. In fact, if you have a look at maize, the ultimate chance of multiple breadbasket failures, this is a collapse in yields of major cultivation regions around the world, goes up 6 to 40% at 1.5 degrees even. And that rises to 54% at 2 degrees. This is one paper, but the estimates are roughly the same across different papers. Another paper found that failures could be as much as 4.5 times higher by 2030 and up to 25 times higher by 2050. And these are in major cereals and major crops. So this is a significant challenge, even under fairly low levels of warming. Some crops might see a small boost, but we have other issues in terms of the nutrition of these crops. As the CO2 increases, the nutrition of those crops can also get down. And remember, it's not just the calories that we're really talking about, it's the micronutrients that we need in order to stay healthy. So these are some of the negative consequences. And I have to say, the further above 2 degrees, the more crazy the situation becomes in terms of yield losses. At the moment, we're still monitoring yield losses and modeling yield losses up to 1.5, 2 degrees. But beyond that, you're looking at significant impacts. The likelihood of these sort of increases in temperature, which ultimately are quite likely now, is a food price increase that we would see, and then the ultimate upheavals in the last part of the 2000s that we saw around the world from food riots around the world when food prices increased there. So that's really the negative case. Beyond 2050, it's really hard to sort of model and tell what exactly the impacts would be on food systems.
Okay, so we're heading straight toward disaster unless we make major changes. Helen, would you like to say something about what's happening in the UK and Scotland in terms of food and our possibilities for changing our diets?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just talk a little bit about one of the research analyses that I was involved in, which looked at the UK. And we took a land use approach to looking at food, and we looked at how much of the current land use is occupied by animal agriculture, as an example of one of the kind of hotspots in the food system. And it's actually most of the country we dedicate to animal agriculture. And not just in terms of pasture land, but we also looked at crop production. And we currently use around 55% of all crops produced in the UK for animal feed. So there's a really substantial kind of footprint associated with that particular aspect of agriculture, which I think really lends itself to a low-hanging fruit option to start those shifts. And there's really big potential. So if we just think about that cropland, for example, that's another 55% of our crops that we could actually transition to human edible crops rather than feeding them to livestock, which is actually incredibly inefficient. We actually lose a lot of energy. So for example, to produce 1 calorie of beef requires somewhere around 40 calories of crops to go into that. So there's this huge loss of efficiency in the system, which I think really lends itself to a good starting point in terms of how to prepare ourselves for this really uncertain future as well in terms of food. As Paul said, we're not actually sure what all of the impacts would be, and that doesn't factor in the kind of shocks as well to the system that might come from extreme weather events, for example, that we're not really prepared for or thinking about. So there's really a lot of benefits from having a resilient food system that isn't using lots of extra resources that at this point in time we just don't have to spare.
Thank you. Well, in the United States, I think it's even worse. We're using a huge portion of our land to grow feed or to graze, particularly cows, and that's producing a serious problem with methane around the world. There's an idea of feeding seaweed to cows and taking out 30% of that methane, but there's still that other 70% that we have to be concerned with. At one point in our process in America, we had a Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Earl Butz, who famously said to farmers, "Get big or get out." And that was the beginning of the monocultures and the industrial operations that have been scraping soils around the world, because we spread our system around the world. Can we go back to producing food at a more human scale? Should we go back to smaller farms? Should we bring farmers back? Can we create new jobs? What would that situation be like?
It would be very much dependent on the region you're talking about, the sort of opportunities and technologies available in those regions. What we have to remember is, to Helen's point, is that, you know, we really need a great food transition in the same way we talk about energy transitions. And we've been talking about energy transitions a lot, but the great food transition is absolutely necessary in the same way. And without it, we would reach climate collapse and biodiversity collapse on its own. So even if we manage to transition the entire energy system, if we don't transition this food system, it's not going to work out well. In the great food transition, there's basically 3 main areas. There's diets, food waste, and food production. And all 3 allow more intercropping. They allow more smallholder farmers in some regions. They allow reduction in inputs. The other issues that we have in the food system, for example, in biodiversity, the massive amounts of nutrients that we apply to the land, the air pollution that we have from animal agriculture. And so these 3 sort of opportunities really will allow for many of the things that you're talking about, this move away from monocultures.
Right. Well, one of the disasters we have is the herbicide-pesticide paradigm. We have now super weeds that are almost impossible to take out of the ground, and we have nature adapts. So we have insects that have adapted to the insecticides. In perhaps the best case, we've lost so many insects, and that's taken out our bird populations. We've been in a war with nature and a wartime mentality, but we could go to a wartime mentality as they had in the Second World War, where we had victory gardens, where we had people raising food, a return to a sense of the land and to the necessity of having local food. We know that transportation is a big issue for food. Refrigeration is a big problem because it uses so much energy. But I wonder how you see the future in terms of farming.
Yeah, so just to pick up on that point about localization of food production and transportation, most of that environmental footprint actually comes from the production side of things, and relatively little is actually related to the transport aspect. And then in terms of actual kind of food production techniques, so if we think about organic, for example, in order to do that would actually require more land than conventional production. Related to yield, so you basically get less yields generally from organic production. So in order to kind of roll that organic model out as an example, we would actually need to change what we're producing as well in order to have the space to do that.
So could you give us an example of the kinds of foods we need to move away from and the kinds of crops we would need to be growing and as we adapt to climate change?
Beef is really at the top. I mean, that accounts for 6% of our global greenhouse gas emissions just from that one food. Or another comparison is it has the same emissions as the entire country of India. So if we're looking for a kind of starting point, that would be an obvious place, I think.
And just on that point, we just don't have the space. About 35% of all habitable land is used for animal agriculture. And if we were to have this change on the production side, on the diet side, it opens up so many opportunities for organic agriculture. And to what Helen was saying there before, the current system it brings more yield because we're going into more ecological debt.
Yeah.
We're pumping it full of nutrients and going into that debt, and so we do get that yield. But if we have this great food transition, we free so much land that we can actually then do some of these other options, do some of these other more organic, more intercropping options.
Right. Well, fertilizer itself is releasing nitrous oxide, which is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas and is affecting the ozone layer. What would the fertilizer be of the ideal?
First thing again, it's the production side. So to keep banging on about it, the production side and also some of the behavior change. So if we change the diets and we reduce the food waste, then we need far fewer inputs. And actually, if you look at most of the global modeling on this, those two make up the largest component. Production systems can change and they help. But those two alone make up more than 2/3 of the total opportunity, well, close to 80% of the opportunity there. The production systems can only sort of do so much. On the nitrogen side of things, there are ways in which you can reduce nitrogen already with so-called precision agriculture. So using much smaller amounts at the moment, we spread it quite liberally on fields, and we don't need to be doing that. We can be much more precise about that.
Right. There are also crops that fix nitrogen.
So one of the best things that you would have by opening up some of this space and having more intercropping is that you could plant legumes, which do actually fix nitrogen, as you say, in between other crops, and you can have more crop circulation as well.
Right. And as we shifted away from beef, well, let's talk a little bit about moving to poultry and fish. For a while, we thought that was a great idea or a healthy idea, but it really isn't.
Beef, to be honest, is the largest impact here. But beyond that, fish is a close second. And a lot of that is due to the energy inputs for that fishing. So absolutely, and to your point about plant-based diets, I mean, we've barely scratched the surface in the new flavors that we could discover just by experiencing new different plant. I mean, we're heavily reliant on 4 main cereals, and we only eat quite a small, narrow range of vegetables. And there's so many other sort of heritage plants and foods that we could be eating. And so one way to communicate this is really an opportunity. This is an opportunity for fancy restaurants, for catering, for at home to discover new recipes. This is not necessarily a messaging of abstinence. You've got to cut out that meat. If the system responds by individual making these different choices about diets, there will be lots of opportunities for new, exciting dishes. And I think that's something that we really need to point out.
Yeah, it's not deprivation, it's exploration.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We waste a lot of food, as you mentioned. If you go on a cruise, you'll see horrible amounts of food being wasted. But even in our normal process of supermarkets and restaurants, how can we control waste in the system and feed more of the people?
Well, in high-income nations, there's a lot of habitual change. So the Danes did quite well during the last few years in reducing food waste through a national campaign. And it was led by well-known personalities in Denmark. And that's a really, really useful way in order to get change, is to find the people who are the real sort of critical points. Who listens to them? You know, maybe the famous chefs, the Jamie Olivers, or whoever, what are the major chefs, and really get this message across that it's not embarrassing to ask for a doggy bag. You know, so in Denmark, for example, they said to waiting staff, you know, ask whether they would like a doggy bag. Don't make people feel awkward about it. In areas in France, you actually get fined for throwing out food, and so supermarkets now are setting up informal networks, getting food to people who need it. There are lots of different things that can be done. There's many different ways to attack the problem of food waste in the avoidable food waste in the high-income nations. There's a lot of similarities between the energy transition and the food transition. So if you have this urban redesign where you have walkable cities, that has impacts on food waste. If you have available shops near you where you can just go and pick up your food on that day, then it's much easier to plan ahead. So these issues that we know we need to fix actually have multiple knock-on effects to food systems. And it's really, you know, about highlighting those co-benefits, because too often we're talking about just climate change when actually we could be talking about lots of these other co-benefits too.
Your book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, it's certainly the worst of times. Well, I think we can all see that. How do we see this as the best of times?
Partly, it's all the things that we know we need to do are actually just going to be better anyway. We are going to go through a very bumpy period. Temperatures will continue to rise until we get to net zero or zero, and we will see intensifying problems both in food systems and energy systems. But a lot of the things that we know we need to do are actually better to mitigate and also adapt. So to give you some examples, renewables are much better at being moved around during climate disasters. There's work that shows that large wind arrays in the North Sea and in other countries can actually reduce the level of onshore storm surges. So you can actually reduce the extreme weather events through the things that we know need to do to mitigate already. If we get more explosive growth in plant-based diets and really cut out this meat, this is what we're going to need, because some of these food yield reductions are happening at quite low temperatures. And so if we actually start exploring these plant-based diets, you can get ahead of these problems already.
Mm-hmm. Helen, you were telling me about the fish that are herbivorous, that they're eating the shorelines in a sense, and the need to shift to other species of fish or to control those herbivorous fish that are harming the riverbeds, I guess, and the shorelines?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting dynamic, and it's something that we see on land as well. So if we basically interrupt that the ecosystem dynamics by removing predator populations, for example, then we will no doubt see an increase in herbivorous or prey populations. So one classic example is Yellowstone Park, where wolves were removed. There was an explosion in deer population, and that had really disastrous impacts on the vegetation and the whole ecosystem. So we see a similar thing in the oceans. When we remove the predator populations, we see this explosion of herbivorous or prey populations who obviously eat vegetation. Coastal vegetation is a really important carbon sink. One analysis showed that it could actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere about 40 times faster than tropical rainforest. So in terms of the sort of urgency and the speed of action that we need, that's a really promising mitigation option to actually reinstate that coastal vegetation to remove CO2 quickly from the atmosphere. But to do that, we need to control those herbivorous or prey populations by reintroducing the predator populations to restore that ecosystem balance.
Well, of course, with every solution, there's funding and there's lack of funding. And in the case of food, there are subsidies. And many subsidies are going to the very worst things. How can we put pressure on our governments to change the direction of the money? As soon as the money direction flows in a better direction, we have a much better chance.
Currently, the subsidies are encouraging deforestation, are encouraging monocultures, are encouraging a whole set of negative outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
there are some attempts to wind down these subsidies. So, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy now includes provisions for biodiversity protection, but it's been roundly criticized for the actual outcomes. And at the moment, it's only a very small percentage of the total budget. And so really, we need to see this changing much faster. And I think this comes to this point of how do you support farmers through this transition? Right now, we're talking about changing what we eat quite dramatically, changing the way the countryside looks quite dramatically. For example, some work that we looked at, if you had a plant-based diet in the UK, you would save an area roughly the size of Scotland in terms of land, which does mean lots of nature access to a lot of people, but you've got to think of the farming community and how that works. And so I think subsidies clearly is that money is available already to be helping farmers through this transition, to pay for biodiversity protection, to pay for carbon sequestration. In the study that I just mentioned before, we looked at high-income nations, and if high-income nations went to plant-based diets, you could sequester enough carbon that would equate to 12 years of global agricultural emissions over the long term. So that's a total opportunity that is massive if we were able to do it. But of course, huge upheaval for farmers. And so we really need to see some of those subsidies going into supporting farmers through this transition.
Yeah, that's a very important point. The money is there.
Yeah.
And people will not lose their jobs if we do this correctly. People will transition to a healthier life. And our plan is to become healthier. We need to make that shift.
And we've got to start leading in the high-income world. The middle and lower-income nations, they don't have, I'd say the luxury of having, obesity epidemics and malnutrition. And so there has to be some sort of leadership in what is shown in the media, in what is shown as a good life across society. Because currently in lots of areas of the middle income world, you have something called the double impact of malnutrition, where you can be having enough calories but not enough micronutrients. So you can have problems with too much calories, at the same stage have anemia and all sorts of other issues. So it's making people very sick, the double burden of malnutrition.
The inequality in our food system is shocking, and it's one of the things that we need to be addressing first. In the minute that we have left, I wonder if there's anything that you wanted to say.
I think just to kind of echo Paul's point about leadership in high-income countries, so we do tend to think about agriculture and the kind of current issues around deforestation associated with low-income countries or developing economies, but actually high-income countries have already been there and done that and deforested, so there's really the biggest opportunity from the restoration piece in high-income countries, and that's where the leadership should come from on that front.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to add, we can't be offshoring this idea of biodiversity protection. Fencing off biodiverse regions in other nations overseas outside the rich world on behalf of us to keep biodiversity. We should be sorting out the biodiversity in our own regions, and we have a huge possibility to be doing that. So let's not be colonial about this idea of biodiversity protection elsewhere.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. This has been a really great discussion. I really appreciate both of your input. And we thank all of you for coming. We appreciate your being here and listening to this discussion. Thank you.